There are moments that never find their way into photographs, never become part of conversations, and never demand that anyone notice them. And yet, somehow, they become the very moments that quietly change everything. Somewhere beyond what you can currently see, a heart has just gone through one of those moments. It did not happen with applause or dramatic announcements. It arrived gently, like the first soft warmth of morning entering a quiet room after a very long night. And the person feeling it most deeply is someone whose thoughts continue finding their way back to you. Do not skip this, because something meaningful is waiting to be understood, and it is unfolding through one quiet heartbeat after another, perhaps for much longer than you ever realized. Your soulmate has been carrying emotions they could barely explain, even to their own heart. There were days when they smiled while secretly wondering whether hoping for something more was asking too much. There were peaceful evenings when your name appeared not as something they actually said, but simply as a feeling they could not push away. They remembered little signs that somehow reminded them of you. They replayed tiny moments that almost everyone else would have forgotten. None of those moments seemed powerful enough to change anything by themselves, but when they came together, they created something remarkable, a quiet certainty that continued, refusing to disappear. Then something inside them shifted. It was not because everything around them suddenly changed. It happened because their heart finally stopped fighting against something it had been trying to understand for a very long time. There was no dramatic scene, no sudden announcement. A familiar place suddenly felt different. An ordinary conversation stayed in their mind much longer than they expected. A simple silence seemed to carry a meaning they had overlooked again and again. It felt as though invisible pieces that had been scattered throughout their life were slowly and gently falling into the places where they belonged. And in that moment of stillness, they finally began to understand why every path inside them seemed to lead toward the same destination. The realization did not make them laugh with excitement. Instead, it brought tears to their eyes. These were not tears of pain, disappointment, or regret. They were the quiet kind of tears that come when someone suddenly realizes they were never simply imagining everything. Imagine looking for a distant light while moving through a thick fog, only to realize that the light had been guiding you the entire time. That is what this realization felt like within them. Their heart somehow became lighter and heavier at the exact same time. Lighter because the uncertainty that had followed them for so long was finally beginning to disappear. Heavier because they suddenly understood just how deeply they had cared without ever allowing themselves to fully admit it. Perhaps you have noticed something unusual within yourself recently without understanding where it came from. Maybe certain memories have started returning when you least expect them. Maybe a strange sense of peace has appeared during moments when you thought confusion would be there instead. Sometimes two hearts connected by genuine affection begin changing long before either person has the courage or opportunity to speak about it. They move quietly, almost like two separate melodies, slowly discovering that they were always meant to become part of the same song. Stay until the end, because this is only the beginning of what neither of you has completely recognized yet. Your soulmate has not shared these emotions with everyone around them. In reality, most people who see them would probably never imagine what is happening beneath their calm exterior. They continue living through ordinary routines. They answer familiar questions. They smile when the situation expects them to smile. They carry on as though nothing significant has changed. Yet underneath all of that, something beautiful has awakened. Now every ordinary moment seems to contain an extraordinary question. What if this feeling is actually leading them somewhere real? What if the emotion they have tried to understand is not something temporary? What if the person who keeps returning to their thoughts is there for a reason? That question has slowly become impossible for them to silence. And what surprised them most was the reason behind their sudden happiness. It was not a promise. It was not a special event. It was not some dramatic occurrence that everyone could see. It was something much smaller, much more personal, and so subtle that they almost missed it completely. The discovery came quietly, almost like a whisper rather than a voice. Yet the instant they recognized it, the tears came back. This time, they were even softer, carrying a sense of gratitude they could hardly put into words. They have not told anyone what that discovery actually was. Not yet. Even they are still trying to understand how something so simple could reach so deeply into their soul. And when you finally understand what they realized, you may begin to see why this quiet moment has the potential to change everything that comes afterward. A quiet truth has a powerful way of revealing itself only when all the unnecessary noise finally disappears. That is exactly where your soulmate found themselves. They were not surrounded by excitement or dramatic circumstances. They were simply wrapped in a kind of silence that suddenly felt completely different. The silence was no longer empty. It seemed filled with answers they had been overlooking for far too long. Do not skip this, because the meaning behind those silent tears is only beginning to reveal itself, and something important is still waiting for you to understand. The discovery that touched their heart did not come from another person's advice. It did not arrive because of some extraordinary event. It came through an ordinary moment that could easily have passed without being noticed. They paused for only a brief second, but that pause gave them enough space to recognize something they had been unable to see clearly before. Every time they imagined a future that genuinely felt peaceful, your presence appeared naturally inside that picture. They did not force the thought. They did not intentionally search for it. They were not trying to create an imaginary future, yet your presence kept appearing again and again, quietly, naturally, consistently, and with a familiarity they could no longer dismiss. At first, they questioned themselves. They wondered why the feeling refused to disappear. They asked themselves why every hopeful thought somehow seemed to circle back toward the same person. They tried to convince themselves that there had to be another explanation. They kept themselves distracted with busy days, familiar responsibilities, and routines that gave their mind somewhere else to go. They told themselves that perhaps this was simply a passing emotion, something that would eventually fade if they stopped giving it attention. But every attempt to move away from the feeling seemed to bring them even closer to the truth they had been quietly avoiding. That realization became overwhelming, but in the most beautiful possible way. They finally understood something they had once overlooked. Happiness is not always loud. It does not always arrive with celebration, excitement, or some obvious sign that everyone can recognize. Sometimes happiness enters your life almost silently, like the first gentle breeze after an afternoon filled with heat. Sometimes it appears through the smallest realization that the person who brings peace to your heart has been occupying your thoughts for much longer than you were willing to admit. And when that understanding finally settled inside them, they smiled through tears they never expected to shed. Those tears carried gratitude. Gratitude that they had not completely stopped believing in kindness. Gratitude that hope had somehow survived the moments of uncertainty. Gratitude that there could be someone whose memory brought comfort instead of confusion. Gratitude that even after everything they had questioned, one feeling still remained steady. Your soulmate did not feel as though they had finally reached the end of some long journey. Instead, they felt as though they had finally discovered the correct direction after wandering through countless uncertain paths. It was not the feeling of everything being finished. It was the feeling of finally knowing where the next step needed to lead. Stay until the end, because what happened after this surprised even them. Without planning it or consciously trying to make it happen, they began noticing small reminders of you in places they never expected. A familiar melody suddenly awakened an emotion they could not explain. A passing conversation echoed words they had once quietly spoken to themselves. A simple phrase reminded them of something they had tried to forget. Even the quietest evenings began to feel different, almost as though the world itself had become gentler simply because their heart was no longer fighting against what it already knew. They still have not spoken these thoughts aloud, and it is not necessarily because they are afraid. Sometimes certain emotions feel too valuable, too delicate, or too meaningful to rush into words. They wanted to understand what was happening within themselves before allowing another person to see it. So they continued carrying this quiet happiness privately, protecting it almost like a small flame that could easily be disturbed by the wind. They did not want to expose it before they were certain of what it meant. They did not want outside opinions to interfere with something that had only recently become clear to them. They needed time to sit with the feeling, to understand it, and to discover whether this peace was temporary or whether it was pointing towards something much deeper. And while they were doing that, something else began happening. The more they stopped resisting their emotions, the more peaceful they became. The more they allowed themselves to acknowledge what their heart had been saying, the less they felt the need to search for explanations everywhere else. There was no longer the same desperate need for proof. The feeling itself had begun becoming the answer. Perhaps that is why their tears were different this time. They were no longer tears created by uncertainty. They were tears that came from recognition. Recognition that something they had been questioning for so long had quietly remained present beneath everything else. They began looking back at memories differently. Moments that once seemed random now appeared connected. Conversations that once seemed ordinary carried new meaning. Certain coincidences no longer felt quite as insignificant as they once had. They started wondering whether their heart had understood something long before their conscious mind was ready to accept it. And that question stayed with them, not as an obsession, but as a quiet awareness. They began to realize that sometimes the heart does not need a dramatic event to know what feels genuine. Sometimes it recognizes safety through peace. Sometimes it recognizes connection through familiarity. Sometimes it recognizes a person not because everything is perfect, but because something inside becomes calmer when that person enters the picture. That is what they were beginning to understand about you. You were not simply another thought passing through their mind. You had become associated with a feeling they could not easily replace, a sense of warmth, a sense of peace, a sense that perhaps the future they had secretly wanted was not as impossible as they once believed. And still, there is one detail they have not fully connected. One unexpected piece of this entire story remains hidden even from them. They have noticed the memories. They have noticed the peace. They have noticed the repeated thoughts and the strange sense of familiarity. They have even recognized that whenever they picture a future that feels genuinely right, your presence somehow appears within it. But there is one final realization waiting beneath all of this. Something they have not yet completely understood about why your presence continues returning to their heart. And when that final piece becomes clear, they may finally understand why they could never truly let this feeling disappear. It is the very reason these tears appeared today rather than yesterday. And once that final piece finally falls into its proper place, everything they believed they understood about this connection will suddenly feel much deeper. There is a quiet difference between wishing for something and suddenly recognizing that your heart has already chosen it. Your soulmate crossed that invisible boundary without even realizing the precise moment it happened. One heartbeat, they were simply moving through another ordinary day. The next, they found themselves completely still, wondering how one simple thought of you could bring such an unexpected sense of peace. Do not skip this, because the reason this feeling continues growing has not completely revealed itself yet. For such a long time, they believed happiness would arrive through some grand and unmistakable moment, something dramatic, something impossible to overlook. But life surprised them. Instead of fireworks, it brought them stillness. Instead of certainty being shouted from the rooftops, it arrived as a quiet whisper hidden inside the smallest details. They began realizing that whenever they imagined a place where they truly belonged, your presence seemed to quietly fill the empty spaces without any effort at all. They never needed to force your image into that picture. You simply appeared there as naturally as morning sunlight finding its way through a familiar window. That realization stayed with them long after the moment itself had passed. They smiled quietly to themselves, then stopped for a moment. A question slowly appeared in their mind. One they had never truly allowed themselves to ask before. They wondered what might happen if these feelings had been guiding them towards something genuine all along. And strangely, the question did not frighten them. Instead, it brought them comfort. Because for the first time in a very long time, they stopped searching for reasons to question what their heart already seemed to know. They allowed themselves to remain with the feeling rather than immediately running away from it. And the longer they stayed inside that quiet emotional space, the clearer everything slowly became. Those tears returned again, not because they were consumed by uncertainty, but because they suddenly felt grateful that hope had never completely vanished. They remembered every little coincidence, every meaningful exchange, every unexpected moment, and every subtle sign that had somehow continued pointing them in the same direction. Individually, those moments looked completely ordinary. None of them seemed powerful enough to change anything by themselves. But when placed together, they formed a story your soulmate could no longer simply dismiss or ignore. Stay until the end because the next realization changed the way they began seeing everything surrounding them. They started noticing something they had never paid attention to before. Whenever they thought about your happiness instead of focusing only on their own, their heart seemed to become lighter. It was not about getting something from you in return. It was not about proving their feelings to another person. It was not even about receiving recognition for what they were feeling. It was simply the quiet happiness of imagining you smiling, finding peace, feeling safe, and finally feeling understood. That realization surprised them more than anything else. That was when they understood that this feeling was not created by excitement alone. It was built from care. A kind of care that grows slowly and patiently, asks for nothing, demands nothing, and quietly wishes that another person's path becomes brighter even when they are standing at a distance. They had never known a feeling that could remain so gentle while somehow becoming stronger with every passing day. And yet, there was one small memory that refused to disappear. At first, it seemed almost meaningless, too simple to carry any real importance. But whenever that memory returned, those unexpected tears of happiness appeared again. It was connected to one particular moment involving you, a moment so ordinary that almost anyone else might have forgotten it only minutes later. Your soulmate could not forget it because something hidden inside that memory carried a meaning they had only recently begun to understand. And when the reason that forgotten moment remained alive inside their heart finally becomes clear, the story you have been listening to will take a direction neither of you may have expected. Some memories refuse to disappear, not because they were dramatic or extraordinary, but because they quietly become the place where a person's heart begins to understand itself. Your soulmate has returned to one particular memory more times than they could possibly count. Every time they revisit it, something feels slightly different. Every return seems to uncover another layer they somehow failed to notice before. And with every reflection, the happiness inside them becomes a little more profound. Stay until the end because the deeper meaning of that memory is only now beginning to reveal itself. It was not a dramatic conversation. It was not some enormous life-changing event. To anyone observing from the outside, it would have appeared completely normal. It may have been nothing more than a passing thought, a brief interaction, or a tiny emotional moment that seemed to arrive and disappear without making much noise. But the heart often protects the things that the eyes barely notice. Long after everything else had disappeared into the background, that single moment remained quietly glowing inside their memory. At first, they could not understand why it continued staying with them. They tried telling themselves that perhaps they were simply being sentimental. They smiled when remembering it, and then continued with whatever they were doing. Yet somehow the memory always found its way back. It returned during peaceful mornings when the world felt quiet. It appeared during calm evenings when their thoughts became less distracted. It even surfaced during the busiest parts of their day, at times when their attention should have been focused somewhere completely different. The memory never demanded to be noticed. It never forced itself into their awareness. It simply waited quietly until they became ready to understand what it truly meant. Then, one evening, everything suddenly connected. They realized that it was never the actual moment that mattered most. What mattered was how they felt while thinking about you during that moment. For the first time in a very long while, they remembered feeling completely unguarded. There was no desire to impress anyone. There was no need to hide behind uncertainty. There was no reason to pretend that their heart belonged somewhere else. Inside that memory, everything felt honest, peaceful, and real. And that sense of honesty moved them far more deeply than they ever expected. Do not skip this because the next realization completely changed the way they began looking toward the future. Instead of constantly wondering whether happiness would ever find them, they began wondering what kind of person they wanted to become if that happiness truly arrived. Their thoughts slowly moved away from fear and began turning toward gratitude. They wanted to become more patient. They wanted to become more understanding. They wanted to become more present, not because anyone had demanded that they change, and not because you had asked them to become different, but because genuine affection has a quiet way of inspiring personal growth. Real feelings can sometimes make a person want to become softer without making them weaker. They can make someone more thoughtful without taking away their strength. Without even noticing it at first, your soulmate began carrying themselves differently. The people around them noticed small changes. There was a softer smile on their face, a calmer quality in their voice, and a peaceful confidence that had not seemed to exist before. Nobody understood the reason behind those changes. Nobody knew what had shifted inside them. Nobody could see that behind those quiet differences was a heart that had finally stopped fighting against itself. They were no longer spending every moment trying to convince themselves that they should not feel what they felt. Yet there is something your soulmate still has not told anyone. It is not necessarily because they are deliberately hiding it. It is because they have not yet discovered the exact words capable of expressing it properly. There is one sentence they have repeated silently inside their own mind again and again. Every time they whisper those words within themselves, those quiet tears return. It is not exactly a confession, it is not a promise. It is something much more personal than either of those things. It is a realization so simple that it nearly escaped their awareness, yet so powerful that it has slowly begun changing the way they look at every day ahead. They have started understanding that some connections do not become meaningful because of how loudly they are expressed. Sometimes their greatest meaning appears in the silence between two people. Sometimes the heart understands something long before the mind is ready to explain it. That is why these emotions have continued growing even when there has been no dramatic event to create them. The feeling has been developing quietly in the background, almost like a seed that has been beneath the surface for a long time. Nothing seemed to be happening from the outside, yet underneath everything, something was slowly becoming stronger. There were days when your soulmate questioned everything. There were moments when they wondered whether they had imagined the depth of this connection. There were times when they tried to convince themselves that perhaps it was simply nostalgia, curiosity, or an emotional attachment that would eventually fade. But each time they attempted to push the feeling away, something inside them brought them back to the same realization. The feeling was not disappearing. It was becoming clearer. And clarity often arrives quietly before it becomes impossible to deny. They began understanding that missing someone is not always about wanting them physically present every second. Sometimes missing someone means carrying their presence into ordinary moments. It means seeing something beautiful and instinctively wishing they could experience it too. It means hearing a familiar song and suddenly remembering a feeling you thought you had forgotten. It means finding yourself smiling for no obvious reason because a particular person has quietly crossed your mind. Your soulmate began experiencing these little moments more often than they wanted to admit, and each one seemed to remind them that something inside their heart had changed.